So, where to start? I don't know, some of you may remember that in the 1950s, I didn't actually listen to it, but I heard the advertisement. There was a soap opera on the radio called As the World Turns. Yes? So this is As the World Turns lecture. If you listen to the news in the last hour, because yes, John Bolton has just been fired. I wouldn't applaud too loudly because the next person may not be better. Okay, so much is happening, and let me try to put it a little bit in structural context. I've talked before about historians and students of international affairs looking at the world in systems. Also, people looking at countries at countries' systems. They say, for example, there's been a revolution. Generally speaking, a revolution is identified after it's taken place because sufficient amount of internal structure has taken place so that when historians look at it, they say, actually, a revolution took place, but they don't always say it during the process unless there's sort of a cataclysmic change. Well, in the world of international affairs, there are also systems, and it refers to sort of the same thing. Actors change, structures change, ideologies change, and so forth. And you might recall my saying that, for example, one talked about the 19th century international system, which lasted until the First World War. Then came the interwar system, and then came post-World War II, the Cold War, and all the rest. And in some senses, many analysts decided that after '89, when the Cold War was over, some fundamental change had taken place. And in the way, of course, it did. That is to say, especially in the U.S., people said, we've won, now, it's the American century, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I would like to propose that actually, the more radical changes have taken place within the last few years. And there's been a fundamental structural system change, not in '89, but in very recent years. And what does that amount to? It amounts to the fact that almost all the things that were put in place after the Second World War, the institutions that have been put in place, the sort of ideologies that were put in place have either eroded or been nixed in recent years. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to the fact that the entire institutional structure that was built after the Second World War, the European Union, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, the various agencies of the United Nations, etc., were all functioning even after '89. And for one reason or another, they have fallen in disarray and they're no longer functioning. So we are now living in a world in which the ideology that the way to prevent further wars was to entangle people in international institutions so that they would relate to neighbors and interact neighbors and therefore would not want to go to war with each other. That was an absolute given since the end of the Second World War. Of course, it took some years for these institutions to be developed. For example, in the case of NATO, at '49, in the case of the European Union, 57, 58. But still in all, we got used to the fact that we thought one of the ways to prevent conflict among states of the kind of 19th and 20th century was to entangle countries in a network of relationships. And that is being undone as we speak. Now, how or why is it being undone is actually more complicated than noticing that it is being undone. First, you can say, well, it's globalization. That is to say, countries are now networked and corporations and everybody else is networked on a global scale, and that many of these institutions that were built were actually regional institutions. So you have the European Union, which started out, by the way, with 6 members and now has 28. The European Union is functioning inside, in terms of its membership, of course, England, UK, where's my friend who always says, Irene, who always says I say the wrong thing, United Kingdom, Great Britain, whatever. I can't get it straight, but you know what I'm talking about. That they are intermeshed with each other, but the European Union is not necessarily intermeshed in the same intimate fashion on a global scale, right? So increasingly, the argument is that globalization has, in a sense, superimposed itself on these regional mechanisms of one kind or another, and that the two may, in fact, be in conflict of one kind, of one way or the other. Now, the process of trying to maintain, let me backtrack, there are, of course, global institutions like the United Nations, but the United Nations and its agencies, which are pretty much members, all countries are members, have also sort of eroded over time, not because of globalization, but because bureaucracies tend to erode and need to be reformed. And in order for bureaucracies to be informed, people have to have an interest in reforming the bureaucracies. And that sometimes doesn't exist. And on the part of the United States, it doesn't exist at all right now. So you had international global institutions. The other kind of global institutions you had were sort of technically management institutions. So, for example, the World Trade Organization, which was supposed to monitor and make sure that unfair trade was not happening at a global level. But you also have lots of agencies none of you have ever heard for, that totally technical, that have to do with air traffic and monitoring of communications and so forth. These are all obscure and very technical institutions, but they're dependent on being supported by all the international community, the states, in terms of funding and staffing to function properly. Now, what has happened on a parallel road? On a parallel road, globalization, not these institutions, but globalizations, has created not only economic changes, but also has created conceptual changes. The economic changes are sometimes that people who were employed lose their jobs, industry moves, industry changes, so they're losers in the system of globalization. They're loser people in countries, they're loser countries as well. And so these people are then railing against the policies that seem to come from the outside. For example, the European Union in the case of Great Britain. For example, in the case of the United States, we're disadvantaged by these institutions. We're putting more money into the world than we get back. Whether it's true or not is a separate issue. And so you have within countries, quite aside from the international dimensions, an alienation of feeling that the globalization and these institutions are not helping you. In fact, they're doing you in some fashion. Then the second stream of sort of mental activity that's happening inside of countries is that because of globalization, but in this case not trade so much as visual globalization, the internet and television and so forth, everybody in the world now has access to everything that's going on in the world. Even in the most quote-unquote backward countries, 80% of all Kenyans have access to the internet in one fashion or another, so that you can see what's happening somewhere else. And you might be living in a society where things are not going well, where you have a corrupt leader, where you don't have employment. You have very large unemployment in some countries, including in a few European countries. I mean, it's sort of in the high teens, 20s. In some third world countries, it might be 70% of the population is either unemployed or underemployed. And so people say to themselves, gee, things look a lot better in Britain and France and the United States. Let me go there. And so a combination of instability in some of these countries, conflict, as in Syria and other places, and just a kind of thinking things would be better, I have a better future somewhere else, has led to a fairly large movement of people, millions, 60 million, 100 million, nobody really knows the actual statistic. And many countries, unlike the United States, that people want to go to are fairly industrial countries where things look a lot better, especially if you're watching the internet and the TV. And so you have both legal and illegal attempts to enter other countries. So almost all industrial countries have become more diverse, right? And many of these countries, especially European countries and Japan and South Korea and some others, not only are industrial and seemingly doing well and one aspires to go there, but they're also culturally, racially, linguistically, etc., fairly homogeneous. And so while in the 70s, 80s, even 60s, 70s, 80s, people thought, well, you know, we should welcome people who want to come to our country because they're disassociated in their own countries, are now saying, gee, we now have 9% or 12% of people who are not like us. And so you now have even the most generous and socially conscious countries like Sweden having become quite racist and not wanting people to come into their country. So that's not so much a question of globalization in the sense of just trade, but it's globalization in the sense of visual and technological globalization, which makes people say, gee, it's somewhere better somewhere else, let me give it a try. Now, the U.S. case in point, of course, is quite unique, and I don't want you no doubt know quite a lot about it from watching TV, which is we've always been a nation of immigrants. But of course, now American racism is kicking in because we want white immigrants, proprietary, both by private corporations and by countries, and by stealing technology and technology being able to enter the system. Much of what I talked about is academic. Because let's say you straighten up, let's say you newly support, or you try to support international institutions and international law. Let's imagine the next president being in favor of that. Then what do you do about the Russians interfering in our elections? What do you do about the Russians interfering in European elections? What do you do about the Chinese stealing us blind and all the rest of it? Well, these are separate issues, actually. To begin with, even though other countries, Soviet Union, China, now Russia, and so forth, have at various junctures stolen American technology, it is also the case that in some areas of technology, for example, AI, artificial intelligence, China is actually ahead of us. So the idea that we're at the forefront of everything is no longer the case. Much of the technology that is used, employed, can ban certain things, is far more far-flung in a country like Estonia and Finland than it ever is in the U.S., right? Everybody in Estonia, and everybody, I think in Finland as well, is on some internet connection. They have all your information. You just go to your whatever it is address. You can look up your medical stuff, your utility bills, your taxes, your everything. And they have the capacity to block intruders, right? So the idea, some of you are lots more tech competent than I am, but from what I read, the idea that we're at the forefront of all technology is no longer the case. And I think increasingly it will no longer be the case. So, yes, protections, there have to be protections, and a country has right to protect itself from technological thievery and all the rest. And we certainly do, as the United States, have a right to protect ourselves. But that is not an excuse for engaging in what can only be called juicing conflict with other countries. Right? It's one thing to try to get negotiations going to stop certain kinds of exchanges and certain kinds of theft. It is quite another thing to use that as the basis for getting out of institutions with countries, to badmouth them, to have what we now have, a serious trade war with China and all the rest of it. The trade war and the tariff war and all of that were not necessary in order to have discussions with China about technology and so forth. On the other side, the business of getting into people's election systems, there are ways to stop doing that as well. And rather than employing money and putting the shoulder against the wheel to stop that kind of thing, we are, in fact, at the moment, encouraging it. In fact, you probably read all this business with the Ukraine, where we don't want to give arms to Ukraine to protect itself against the Russians unless the Ukrainians decide that they will help do in potential presidential candidate Biden by fake news. I mean, just think what this is all about, right? So rather than us being at the forefront of criticizing others and protecting ourselves, which we're technologically capable of doing, we are in fact encouraging people we want to intervene in our elections, while at the same time screaming fake news and on the other hand. So I just think that the politics of this are absolutely crazy. And I also believe that the politics of this could help fix it. Not 100%. Countries have always spied on each other in one way or another. But certainly the mess we're in today is self-induced. The mess both on the part of the United States and the fact that rules, global rules, and so forth are eroding. Let me give you an illustration of how they're eroding at the sort of legal policing level. Johnson in the UK has decreed that not only would England get out of the EU, but it will stop sharing security information with all the other 27 countries. And Europe's security and defense is totally based on having the security, not just the economic blanket, but the security blanket of the region. Similarly, the U.S. is increasingly not sharing information with its former allies, which would be protected of the United States. So it's not just, roaming, computer nerds sitting in Santa Cruz who are interfering here. It's the mechanisms to stop illegal activities, which were also regionalized and internationalized, is also eroding. And that, it seems to me, in terms of future conflict, interference in people's elections, instability in regions as well as within countries is as serious as all this economic stuff that I was talking about. So we have layers, if I could just add. We have erosion of the international institutions. We have attacks on them. We have erosion and attacks and disregard of the post-World War II international law, because why should we be covered by anybody else's law? That, by the way, is also a big case in point in England. Who the hell is the European Court of Justice making decisions for Great Britain? We're autonomous, blah, blah, blah. Then you have layers of technology, which used to be sharing, which is eroding. Then you have arms treaties and ways to manage an arms race, which either have been nixed or are eroding. And so we are back to a world which is quickly approaching all the getting rid of and eroding all the protections that were developed over 50 years. And we in the United States are as... Okay, let me just add an addendum, and then open it to questions. Even though I made as strong an argument as I could about the U.S. withdrawing its leadership role in the world, it also needs to be said that the U.S. is still sort of creeping all over the world in one fashion or another. When I talk about Africa, I'll talk about how in God knows how many African countries we have American troops and supposedly fighting terrorists and so forth, but actually in many cases helping to create them. So it's not true that the U.S. military is not, something of a menace in various countries. So the kind of withdrawal I was talking about was the kind of collective military protection and stabilization and so forth. We have a huge military, and as you know, the military gets tons of our money, which could be used for better purposes in some cases. Obviously, every country has a right to defend itself and to have the arms to defend itself. I'm not I'm not anti all countries having a military. But strange things happen in terms of what happens to the military money. And one of the sort of just asterisks is you might have read that Trump has taken it upon himself to move funds from the Defense Department to build his wall. And that sort of raises interesting questions because the money that has been taken has very much been taken from the support for the military, nursery schools and base camps, this, that, and the other thing. So that in point of fact, the soft part of the military that supports the actual soldiers who eventually put themselves in harm's way, that's the money that largely has gone away. And some of the money has actually gone away from strengthening the military part of bases and so forth. And that also seems like a crazy thing to be doing if you're arguing that there's a great danger of the Russians moving into the Baltics. Why would you cut the budgets of the military capacity in the Baltics? But in any event, it's more complex than I made it. Anyway, questions? Yes?
It seems the two most damaging situations, climate change and nuclear proliferation, are not being discussed by our political aspirations to presidency.
Yes, so the comment is that the two things which seem to be, or should be at the top of the list, namely climate change and nuclear proliferation, don't seem to be on the top of the list of the various candidates running for president. I think that's absolutely true. Now, what's the explanation? Don't they know better? Well, let me just spend 2 minutes talking about that. When polls are taken about what people care about, invariably, over time, not just now, it's domestic stuff and economic stuff. And for a major power, the American public has been one of the most ill-informed about international larger issues of any country in the world. Those of you who have traveled, you go to any European country or whatever, and the college-age student, young adults and so forth will know lots about the world and know lots about us. We don't know anything about them and so forth. Part of that is understandable given the scope and size of the country. You know, if you live in Nebraska, the world is very, very far away. If you live along the coast, you have slightly more interest in these matters. So part, of course, what the candidates are aiming at is the interest areas that polls tell them local people who are going to vote for them are interested in. You know, healthcare and, I don't know, policing, guns, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And if you would start, if one of the candidates would start discussing in some kind of intelligent detail about nuclear proliferation, it seems very far away in Nebraska. So that's one part, I think, of the equation. The other funny thing is that mostly Americans who run for president are also not very well informed about international affairs. What they generally do is rely on the Secretary of State and Defense and the State Department. Well, at this particular point, if you were, let's say, a Democratic candidate, and you would go to the State Department and ask for a briefing, what you would probably be told is that nobody's available to give you a briefing. The State Department, almost all the top people in the State Department who worked there for decades and were overseas are gone. In their place have been political appointees, most of whom know nothing about international affairs, and underneath these top people that are political appointments, scores of the most experienced Foreign Service officers have resigned because they simply can't take it. So at this particular point in time, we don't even have centralized institutions with well-equipped people who know about international affairs, and therefore, you know, you could say, well, nuclear proliferation, at least the Defense Department would be on top of that. But the Defense Department has been politicized just the way that NOAA has been politicized and every other thing. The top people are beholden to Trump, and if they say the wrong thing, they're out. And by the way, it is not an accident that most of our departments of government now are run by two types of people. One, the people who were in the industries which they're now supposed to be managing. And two, people who themselves are so beholden to Trump. Number three, I suppose, is that almost all of them are temporary because many of those people would not be approved by Congress. So our government is run by actings all over the place, not by default, but by design. You want somebody that you can control. You put them temporarily. You can take them out very quickly without rattling anybody's, concerns in Congress. So we actually, we as the United States, don't have a very good capacity to deal with things. Notice that the scientific branch of the Agricultural Department, which was at the forefront of various farm stuff, but was also at the forefront of dealing with climate change in agriculture. They were given 33 days to move from Washington, D.C. to Kansas, and because they just wanted to get rid of them, right? And so a lot of them just quit because they couldn't move their families and so forth. And so even that's eroded. So our scientific aspects of various agencies have also eroded. So we're not in a very good shape to do anything right now. But you're, of course, raising a good point, and it's too bad that some of the candidates don't have the knowledge or the interest or the courage to at least try to address it through good advisors and so forth. I agree with you. Yes?
I'm really confused about China and the trade war. And from your perspective, is there a problem that needed to be rectified? And was there a better way to try to rectify it? I really don't understand.
Yeah, let me start with backwards. There certainly was a better way to rectify. Both the United States as a government and we as a people are not better off by having to pay 30% more for almost anything that's bought in Walmart or any other place. That is not a plus, all right? Some of the conditions put upon China in this trade war also are hurting China to some extent, but China very quickly is trying to get alternatives. So, for example, China used to buy all its soybeans from more or less American farmers. Once we banned that, right, they can't sell it, China quickly moved to other sources. Now, unfortunately, the other sources are Brazil. And Brazil says, wow, this is a good thing. It's got a populist right-wing dictator of sorts. And he says, all right, farmers, mow down the tropical rainforests and grow soybeans because now we have a market. So it's not just we are disadvantaged and the Chinese are a little bit disadvantaged, but rather that all kinds of bad second-run things are happening. Now, was there a problem? There's always a problem with trading. If you think there's unfair trade, you can take it to the World Trade Organization, which can adjudicate it, for example. And at various points has adjudicated both in favor and against the United States in certain ways. Are the Chinese, pure as a driven snow? Of course not. Have they stolen American, stuff in high tech? Yes, they have, but they have less and less need to do so. And the other thing is, supposing I really have a claim against you, okay? Rather than doing stupid world impact things like having a tariff war, maybe the thing is you and I could sit down, our representatives could sit down, and we could bargain over it. And the unwillingness to do that and to immediately, one day 25% tariffs, the next day 30, then you take them down back to 10, you take them, the disruption that has caused. And then saying to, let's say, the English, get out of the EU and then we'll have a bilateral trade agreement. And the English Brexiteers saying, see, that's exactly what we want. We want bilateral things. We don't want to have European rules applied to us and so forth. It's like going in a circle. Because to begin with, this easy bilateral relationship that's going to bail England out of getting out of Brexit isn't so easy. It actually has to go through Congress in this case. And it's going to take a long time, and it may never come, and if it comes, whatever. So there's a lot of fiction running around. And generally speaking, countries who go to the negotiating table lose some and gain some. And when you have a trade war, everybody loses. And that's what's happening. Everybody. Yes?
What's the possibility that Trump will be reelected?
Let's put it this way. Is there a chance that Trump could get reelected, or what's the possibilities? I sat in our living room with friends in the last election and said, I bet you he's going to get elected, and everybody in the room said, you're wrong. What do I think now? I think he could get reelected. I have no crystal ball as to whether he would. I think that when you see interviews, which is all I can go by, of Trump's supporters who supported Obama but then supported Trump, being now asked whether they're going to vote against Trump, they say no, because while I don't like him and he's done sleazy things, he's done great things for the country. Look at the low unemployment, look at the economy, it's going well, and so forth. So I can easily see, especially with how various election districts are zoned, how states, whatever, I can see that he could get reelected. Whether he will or not, I do not know. And it, of course, also depends on who the candidate is. And even, if you're asking me who would be the best candidate to defeat Trump, I have no idea. Because we already know that white males don't want to vote for women, white or any other color. Hardly any white males voted for Hillary Clinton. It was white females, African Americans, and others. So if you look at how things break down, it is the case that, on the whole, African American voters in states where they dominate will chances are vote for a Democrat, even though local elections are Republican. But which Democrat would be best to engage in? And the other thing is, there is a conservatism even amongst very liberal Americans. And the conservatism is one of, yes, of course, everybody should have reasonable health care, but I really don't want my personal health care taken away because it's really good.
But you're defining Biden. I mean, what you're really doing is making an argument for Biden.
Well, it makes an argument for Biden, but it also there are also this disabling characteristic to Biden. I mean, the minority vote and the moderation on health care and so forth is a vote for Biden. On the other hand, you are counting in this next election on younger generation people voting, and they sure as hell don't want Biden. So I don't know how to cut that. I have no predictive capacity. I am not any more intelligent than you guys are.
And you think a woman cannot be president?
I'm not saying she can't be. I'm saying that there is a problem in terms of white males voting for a woman, white or black. How much of a problem, whether it can be overcome, I have no idea. All I'm saying is you're having me babble up here because I'm no smarter than you are.
Positive actions that we could take to make things better in the world.
Somebody who is more religious than I would say prayer. But aside from that, look, we are very lucky to live in a very activist community. It's not only liberal, but it's activist. People locally are doing things about environment and all that kind of stuff. And people certainly need to get engaged locally. And treating immigrants and asylum seekers decently and looking out after, proper education, so forth. We can do tons locally. And the place that we have most leverage is, of course, local. Right? Now you say, well, can't we do something nationally? Well, at the end of the day, you can join the American Civil Liberties Union, which is not a bad thing because they are litigating many of these national policies. So if you have money and inclination, you can put your shoulder to the wheel of national organizations which in fact are doing things. The ACLU is about the only thing that stands between these poor kids down at the border and getting reasonable treatment and so forth. So they do a lot of good, right? So that's another thing one can do. If one doesn't have but you're saying, well, I may not be rich. Well, $10, $100, any kind of support would be useful. Then it comes to political campaigns. Well, that's sort of not very useful in the state of California because California is going to go Democratic no matter who's saying. And so knocking on doors, getting people to vote in California is not very helpful. In other states, it's helpful. The problem of Californians going to other states is when they ask you where you're from, they don't like the idea in Nevada that you're telling them what to do. So I have lots of friends who are out there, in other states during election time, getting out the vote. If one is so inclined, one can do that. If one does that, the thing to do is not to try to lobby for a candidate, but simply to try to get out the vote so that they don't feel that you're trying to interfere. But being from California, in the many states in the United States, is not a good thing. It's tantamount to being called a pinko in 1950s and 60s. Yes?
I'm very concerned about what's happening in China vis-a-vis Hong Kong. And I was wondering if you have anything that could help us illuminate what's happening.
Well, yeah, what's happening in Hong Kong. I actually want to talk about that when I talk about China and whatever, but let me just summarize it by saying the Hong Kong, especially Hong Kong youth, wants to keep as much autonomy as it can, and the Chinese government wants to take as much as they can, and there's a serious conflict. And on the other hand, the Chinese have a stake in having Hong Kong be different from the mainland for economic reasons. So they're not, marching in right away. If things get too out of hand, they might march in, but they're trying hard not to march in and to deal with it by remote control. But I promise to talk about that in more detail, okay? Yes, Pink.
These communities that you refer to where all the businesses are closed, there's no jobs, are any of them actually improving under Trump?
No, they're actually not improving under Trump, except that in some of, this is sort of an interesting aside. A lot of these barren communities where nothing is happening, some of these asylum seekers and immigrants have moved in. And as soon as you get 1 or 2 families to move in, they make a motel operational, they start a little business, they do what, and the economy of the community is turned around. And people complain that people speak Spanish or whatever, but the truth of the matter is they economically turn the community around. So then the question is, you know, we don't really like these people. On the other hand, you know, they're not like us, but on the other hand, they've turned the economy around. So there are some communities in places like upstate New York I read about and so forth that have economically been turned around by new people coming in. And speaking of that issue, part of the problem of some of these communities is not only that industry has moved out, but you also, what's left is an aging population. Right? And the aging population, by the way, is another dimension of what I talked about earlier. That is to say, most industrial countries, and even some that you don't think of industrial as yet, like China, are aging out. And aging out means you no longer have an adequate labor force. So most countries now are asking people to keep working longer. But in addition to that, that's going to stop soon in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Japan, in lots of places. And so then the question is, where do you get your labor from? Where do you get your shopkeepers from? Where do you get nurses from? Where do you get anybody from? Well, at the moment, the world is supplied by labor that is temporary contract labor. For example, Japan is full of contract labor from the Philippines. In fact, I think it's 20% of the Philippine budget is money coming back from people who are working overseas, right? But these are temporary people, and they have to get, you know, they have to leave again. Well, in many countries, that's not working. That is to say, even people who move out on move in on temporary contracts, then for one reason or another want to stay. Which, by the way, links to Trump's citizenship business. The 14th Amendment says that if you're born in the U.S., you are a citizen. Doesn't matter who you're born to. And Trump thinks he can get rid of that. Which means, of course, that if a Mexican family comes to Watsonville and works and lives here for 10 years and then has children, their children are Americans. And Trump administration says, well, they may be Americans, but those people then have a choice. They can either leave their kids behind, or better still, which is the newest iteration of this, just because you're born in the United States no longer makes you an American. And that, and well, who knows what the Supreme Court will say. Hasn't gone to the Supreme Court, and he hasn't really moved forward on it. But that's the suggestion of his advisor in the White House as to what to do about this problem. So, many countries, how do people get to be citizens of countries? There are 2 paths. One is through blood, which is which is many European countries, which is if your parents are X, you're X no matter where you're born. So if, let's say, if you're Spanish, and you are living in, I don't know, whatever, Italy, your kids are still Spanish, right? And some countries have a reiteration, which is if you're born overseas, you have your nationality through blood from your parents. In some cases, you can decide at age 18 or 21 whether you want to be this, that, or both, or whatever. The other path is through birth, which is what most new countries did, because quite obviously, as people were coming to the U.S. over the centuries, you wanted people born in the U.S. to have a stake in the U.S. and to be citizens and all the rest. And Trump people are toying with removing that. Yes, it would go to the Supreme Court, and yes, it's a serious issue. And then, you know, what did the 14th Amendment really mean? The 14th Amendment was meant to address slavery and all the rest of it. Does it really mean, you know, people from El Salvador? And it's potentially a big battle. But in any event, all the countries that we're talking about, more or less, will age out and will need workers from other countries, mostly sometimes in the century, in some cases in the next 10 or 20 years. Okay? So that means people should get used to the fact that people who don't look like themselves are going to be there and they're going to be useful. There was a hand, you had a hand, yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the American century, and does that have specific years like 1945 to 2045, or is it just a general idea?
It's a general idea. It by and large goes from the Second World War until where it ends. Trump would say it hasn't ended. Many Americans would say it hasn't ended. Or you could say it's kind of ended when we started eroding as a major power of influence. See, most people think of influence as military and economic power, but influence very often is neither of those. It's moral influence, it's respect, it's lots of things. And people tend to discount that, including, somebody else is getting called, including perfectly intelligent, well-meaning people who say, yeah, but that's soft power. And in international politics, one talks about hard power and soft power. The hardest power is military power, but economic and technological power can now be added. And soft power is the persuasive, the role model, the willingness to sit down with somebody and persuade them to compromise. You know, that's really it. There was a hand back there. Yes, ma'am.
I was glad to hear you talking about the sort of personnel destruction in the various forms of the government. I think it's going on more than any of us know, and some of it's insidious. One of my nieces is an attorney for the EPA, and when I called her one day, I didn't realize she was still at work. It was a time zone, and she answered her phone, and then I heard her walking before we would continue our conversation. A door opened, and then a big door slammed, and you could hear she was in the stairwell. And I said, "Do you always go to the stairwell to take conversations?" And she said, "Yes." Especially when my aunt from California is calling. The number was on the, but it's both. You've got to move to Kansas, or you're fired, or you don't dispute anything Trump says, but also this less obvious, but just this overriding fear of a workplace.
Yeah, okay, you're raising an important point, is that many people in various, not just the State Department, but in almost all departments, are freaked out these days to say anything or do anything which opposes whatever the latest machinations of the Trump administration or their boss who answers to Trump are. So there's great fear. People who can get out and have an easy access to another job often get another job. Others are like her niece, who then wants to make sure nobody hears her talk to her aunt and anything might come up of one kind or another. So that's also true in agencies where you think that wouldn't be true, like the CIA, for example. People at the CIA are petrified about what's going on, the State Department and so forth. So in that sense, we have, in the last couple of years, sort of reached a status of other countries in the world that have authoritarian leaders, where people are afraid to speak up. And so if you ask what can we do, one of the things we can do is not get fearful and speak up and be willing to speak up, because it's only when people speak up and resist and support people who are speaking up that we can stop this nonsense.
It's not just what's happening internally in these government agencies. The Trump administration has also, think of the FBI. We all have different views of the FBI, but as an institution, it's not just within the FBI, it's been attacked by the Trump administration. Also, the public view of those agencies has been not just eroded, they've been vilified. There's been a conscious destruction of those agencies.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So what you're raising is the fact that the agencies themselves have been destroyed in terms of our public the belief in them and so forth. There is a good case that just arose which demonstrates that even beyond the FBI, the Justice Department's confidence in the Justice Department is really, really badly eroded. And what's happened there, you may know that the Trump administration has withdrawn the rules, the emission rules for cars, has lowered them, that were raised during the Obama administration. And so the major manufacturers, along with some states like California, have gotten together and say, all right, but we're going to keep them for those states, and we're going to produce cars that meet those emission standards. And the car companies have agreed amongst themselves to do this. And so now the Justice Department wants to take the auto companies to court in order to argue that they're conspiring with each other and that is illegal, right? So you can see how this is all going. It's a very recent indication of something. The Justice Department, God knows, was meant to be apolitical, and all the agencies have been politicized, which I think is the bottom line of your comments. The only people left in those agencies, actually, who haven't been politicized up to now have been the various inspector generals. And these inspector generals are willing to investigate their own agencies and say there's wrongdoing. So, for example, having to do with the immigrants and the refugees and stuff along the border, the inspector generals did studies of these camps and said, no, what the Trump administration is saying is simply not true. These children don't get adequate nutrition or health care or whatever. So there's a very thin reed that we're hanging on in all these agencies. Now, eventually, of course, the inspector generals could change. But in the meantime, so far, I can't think of a single government agencies where the inspector generals have not been self-critical of the activities of their agencies in support of Trump, which is small read, but still. Yes, Mark?
So next week, on the 23rd, I believe, there is a UN climate summit where people from all over the world are coming to talk.
Right.
And that Swedish teenager, Greta Thunberg, is going to speak there.
Yes.
There is a lot of activity around the world about that summit, right?
Right.
There's going to be a strike on this coming up Saturday, and then the following Saturday, all these things. Do you think that I hate to use the word, I'm going to, wait, be careful. That the people, the citizenry, can trump Trump?
I think citizenry can be mobilized in many countries of the world, especially where she's coming from, in Scandinavia and Germany and so forth. I think that mobilizing part of the U.S. is possible. I don't see a national mobilization. But increasingly, people are at least listening, and it may take some time for them to be mobilized. I mean, you're a farmer in Nebraska, and you can't sell your grain to China because of the trade war, and somebody says, well, you're going to support Trump anyway, and you say yes because he's doing the right thing for the U.S. and I'm a patriotic citizen, so I'll eat the fact that I am losing I don't know how many millions of dollars, but I'm sure it'll get better sooner. And then you say, well, how's the crop this year? And then he says, not so good because we've had a drought. And then you say, do you suppose that has anything to do with global warming? And he says, no, probably not. Those are all, left-wing, whatever it is. So can he be convinced? One of the problems is, so we all know about Greta, right? She arrived on a sailboat without any motors. She's unwilling to fly. She is coherent. She's, a role model for lots of kids. Can she mobilize young people? Probably, which is a big first step, maybe college students, high school students, and so forth. Can she mobilize, the American public very quickly? Probably no. But, sometimes you can't get quick change, but you can, for example, let's imagine somebody other than Trump gets elected who believes that there's climate change and that the U.S. needs to participate, right? Having softened the populace through the mobilization of the UN and probably will make it easier for that individual, probably, to get some legislation and some support through. So these things are interconnected. Nothing drastic was going to happen, I don't think, but that doesn't mean that slowly, slowly things can improve. So I'm an optimist. Don't sound like. Yes, ma'am.
I find it difficult to give Trump as much credit as a person, individual. He's obviously not intelligent. What is the group that makes some of these disastrous decisions?
Yeah, I don't know about not intelligent. He is, she doesn't think Trump is intelligent. And so what leads to all these policies? Well, it depends on the policy. But let me just back off and saying, I don't know whether he's intelligent or not, but he is very poorly educated and totally incurious and therefore knows very little. That doesn't mean he doesn't, I don't know what his IQ is, but the fact of the matter is that he doesn't know anything. I've said this before, you show him a map of the world and he couldn't locate Yemen, and yet we have, we send tons of military to the Sudan, whatever. So that is one thing. The other thing is he has views. They're very prejudiced on many things. They're not new views. He's held them for a long time, whether it's on women or whether it's on people different than himself and all kinds of things. And so he surrounds himself with advisors who then morph these inclinations into policies. So let's take the refugee, and there is Mr. Miller. He is the author of all of this stuff for Trump, right? Mr. Miller is interesting. I don't know if you watched this TV program, ever saw him. Mr. Miller's uncle, who is a psychiatrist, apparently a distinguished psychiatrist, has gone on the media in various places to say that, if his nephew would only pay attention to his own origins, which were that his grandparents were refugees from, I think, Russia or the Ukraine or someplace, and that his family history was one of his family being welcomed and rescued by the United States. And here he is, whatever. The question was, do you talk to your nephew? And he said, no, my nephew considers me a non-person. But he wanted to speak for the family and saying, we're all from somewhere. So Miller is the author of, as far as Miller's concerned, there would be no immigration of any kind, no refugees, nothing. We would try to purify ourselves as quickly as possible. So that's him on that. There are people on almost every subject in the White House who are very right-wing. Peter Navarro is his economic advisor. Peter Navarro has been long-standing opponent to free trade and is the author and the supporter of this tariff war, trade war, and so forth. Where does Peter Navarro fit into the economics profession? He used to teach at, Irvine, Riverside, Irvine? Most economists think he's nuts, right? He is considered a cuckoo bird in the economics profession. But there he is. So you could go down topic by topic. You have scientists working in the White House who are climate deniers. You have whatever. So you pull the people in who support your inclinations and then make them even more so. There was the hope when Trump got elected that, once upon a time he was kind of liberal and he was gay-friendly and he was this and he was that. Well, whatever that truth of that may be, you surround yourself with people who are now pursuing your policies, if you don't like what they say, for example, Bolton, right, who's just gone bye-bye. Bolton completely coincided with Trump's inclination on a lot of things. But all of a sudden, he differed a little. Not necessarily in any direction we would want, but anyway, he differed a little. Out he goes. So there are plenty of those people around. And they keep...
Did he choose to leave?
He was fired.
He was fired, thank you.
Or at least that's what the media said. Yes. He disagreed with making an agreement with the Taliban. He argued against that. That's, by the way, an interesting thing which I'll talk about down the road, because it again goes to show how confused and confusing the policy making is. I mean, obviously we need to get out of Afghanistan. Obviously some kind of arrangement needs to be made with the Taliban. Obviously they're going to break it. Obviously you have then censoring mechanisms when they break it, et cetera, et cetera. But only an idiot would think it would be kosher, should I use this word, to have these people come to Camp David on the anniversary of 9/11. I mean, that's just a cuckoo bird idea. You could have brought them quietly before, after, during, whatever, but to have this production on the anniversary of what happened is just absolutely loony, right? Okay, you've been way in the back.
Stephen Miller's father went to UCSC.
Yes.
Stephen Miller's father went to UCSC.
Yeah.
And apparently, I don't know if anybody in here was in his class, but apparently he was in a group of friends with John Laird and other people that we know.
Yeah, well, just goes to show you can't control your offspring. One more question.
Something we haven't discussed domestically, which is still occurring since the last time we met. What is going to happen with gun control?
The short answer is probably nothing. What is going to happen with gun control, which is a domestic thing, but probably nothing. Sad, but true. I do think the NRA is losing leverage to some extent, and over time, perhaps, but not really. All right, 2 more questions, and then I'll liberate you. Yes?
Are there any countries that have done a better job of, I guess, lack of a better word, lifting up those people that have lost their jobs in these parts of the country that are so hopeless?
Oh, sure. In all kinds of European countries, you lose your job, you get 2/3 of your salary for X amount of time. In France, for example, in Germany, you don't normally lose your job, you get retrained in the same business, and they pay you at a somewhat reduced salary to go retrain it, and then when they expand again, you're right there because you're already trained. There are all kinds of programs in those countries that just don't put people out on the street. Yes. And is there some unemployment? Yes, there's some unemployment of various kinds, but in general, job losses lead to retraining, lead to some salaries, lead to lots of continuation of all the social welfare programs. Your babies still go to nursery care, your children still go to kindergarten, you still get your health care, nothing gets removed, etc. Yeah. But we don't believe in that. We're tough. We're on our own, and all right. 1, 2, and it's 7 of 12. Yes.
I want to get away from the world and go back to our democratic politics. You made a little case for the fact that women are not really electable as presidents, conceivably. But what would happen to Elizabeth Warren's chances if she dropped Medicare for all and went to an incremental change in health? Because that seems to be the biggest sticking point for everyone.
Yeah. She's actually quite flexible. She's changed her views on lots of things, moderated. We all know she used to be a Republican and all the rest of it. So it is conceivable that she can and will do that. Whether it will get her over the hump, I don't know. And the other thing is, I sort of said women didn't, tend not to vote for women. It could have been that they didn't want to vote for Hillary. as well. You don't really know. Suburban women who are fed up with Trump might vote for no matter who the Democrat is. There are too many variables. I can't predict this. But you're making a good point, I think. All right, and that's it. Back there.
I would like you to reassure us about two things.
I'll reassure you about what?
Reassure us about two things. I would like you to reassure us that Don Jr. is not going to be appointed to replace Bolton. Ruth Bader Ginsburg will live on. And I would love to have you discuss Mitch McConnell.
Well, maybe Jared will replace Bolton instead of Don Jr. I can't predict. Mitch McConnell, dare I say, he's a corrupt politician, and he will do whatever he thinks he and his wife both are corrupt. Will do whatever it takes. You know all the investments that are going on into Kenya, investments from China, investments from Russia. He will say one thing in Congress and do another thing that's in his interest. I just think, it's, who am I to cast aspersions on the speaker? But I just think he is a terminally corrupt and sleazy politician and will do anything.
I was thinking particularly about the Merrick Garland incident and now Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yes, of course. If she ceases being a functioning, or she dies or whatever, we're going to have a monumental mess on our hands. And he will. Here's an interesting thing, and you've probably observed on TV about what's been happening in the English Parliament, right? Yeah. Where 21, whatever, just quit, his brother quit, and so forth. And you look at that and you say, God, these people at least had some courage. And you look at the American Senate and you say, what is wrong with these people? Privately, they will say they oppose something and they keep voting for it. The lack of courage in our elected official is profound. And I think that's why we're in as much trouble as we are. And it includes Mitch McConnell, but includes all these others, sort of vaguely liberal Republicans on the Republican side, and they will mouth the arms, no, the Second Amendment, and this and that and the other thing. They completely lack courage. And this would be a time on several issues when they would be able to do what the British conservative people did and say, no, we don't approve this. All right, fire us, but see you next time.